Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar. We've got Danny Agosto here from Melio. He's Director of Compliance Operation. And we've got George from Blanc, Head of Legal and Compliance. We're going to be talking about, or they're going to be talking about oversight and QA for compliance program. I'll let you guys do it. Thanks.
Thanks, Abara.
Thanks, Bar. And Danny, thank you so much for joining us. I figured the best way to start is just to go through a little bit of your background, just so give people a sense of what you've done and what you know about the testing landscape.
Absolutely. Well, George, thank you for having me. It's truly an honor and a pleasure. When my compliance background, I would say, or at least in my experience, is unique. My entire experience, work experience, has been in compliance. About a little over 10 years ago, I started off as a compliance analyst at JP Morgan. I was at JP Morgan for about 5 years. I started off in their operations, compliance operations, where I was working, basically clearing alerts from that were generated either from a branch referral, or from law enforcement, or generated from Mantis. And at the time, I joined JP Morgan right after the consent order. And we were coming out of the consent order. And at the time, they were working on what was called the two-touch model. So basically, we had a team of analysts that would work and clear alerts. And if they determined something needed further review, it would go to our second team, who would, our GFCC, or who would basically review our write-ups and determine if a SAR was filed, if it needs to be filed or not. And then in coming out of consent order, JP Morgan was looking for some efficiency, so they went to combine both departments. That's kind of where I got my first taste into testing and oversight, right? So we had to basically merge two departments, and they coined what was basically called a one-touch process. So we're basically an analyst who picks up an alert. They would work the entire case from alert generation to potential SAR filing or closure. So there was a lot of testing and oversight with building out the program and building out the policies, the procedures, and the QA functions of that program. We started the centralized case review unit, or the CCRU, at JP Morgan, which was basically the team that reviewed and filed SARs, but also did QA of the operations program on a quarterly basis. I was at JP Morgan for almost 5 years, and then when I got my true taste into like real oversight, when I started consulting, I worked for a firm called K2. At the time, it was K2 Intelligence, but now it's K2 Integrity. And as a consultant, I did everything under the sun: foreign correspondent banking, audits, advisory, QA, and testing. It's also where I got introduced to the fintech space. I was doing a project for a local New York bank who was doing the onboarding for Payoneer. And I was introduced to Payoneer through the onboarding. And I saw they had a job posting for their BSA officer, and I applied. I worked at Payoneer for 2 years. That's where I kind of got my first taste of fintech and building, and working with the oversight teams and building out the compliance functions. And I absolutely fell in love with it. When I was at Payoneer, I joined right after they went public, and I learned that I really like building things. So I want to go somewhere where I can kind of build something from the ground up. And I came across Melio. I had a lot of Payoneer employees work for Melio. And they had my position open, Director of Compliance Operations, where, at the time they were in the process of applying for their money transmitter licenses here in the States. And they needed someone to kind of come in and build out their compliance operations program. When I started, there were 5 employees doing compliance operations. They were doing everything from sanctions to investigations to UARs filed to our banking partners. And as of today, we are 3 global teams. We have a sanctions department. We have transaction monitoring, because we are licensed in 22 states. And we also have KYC onboarding. And I was able to, with the help of a lot of my colleagues, build out the entire program of Melio. And it's kind of been like my background in compliance, but also my intro into fintech and into building programs.
Well, that's awesome. It sounds like you've really run the gamut between, being in traditional banks, consulting, and then moving your way into fintech. I'm curious, having that entire breadth of experience, what sort of issues have you seen that kind of exist across the board when it comes
Mhm.
to assessing and testing compliance programs and program oversight? And then on top of that, what have you found that's a little bit more unique in the fintech space?
Sure. So I think across the board, the issues when it comes to testing and oversight, whether I'm at a fintech, I'm at the smallest fintech or at the biggest bank at a JP Morgan, is the communication of testing and the importance of testing to um, stakeholders who aren't directly within compliance, right? So, we're testing a product, let's say a transaction monitoring product, um, and we're testing it, and we see certain remediation issues during our internal testing. Having to communicate that to a product manager or an engineer who spent you know endless nights working on this product and telling them like, hey, like I know you've put hours and days of work into this product, but we have to fix it because it's not in line with a specific regulation, or it's not detecting certain thing, or it's not working a certain like a way the way it's supposed to be. Having to communicate that to non-compliant stakeholders is a challenge at kind of anywhere I worked, whether I was at JP Morgan or Payoneer or Melio. um, well, I will say what's unique for the fintechs is by nature, it's just smaller teams you have to communicate with, right? So like getting the head of engineer or the head of product on a call at, a 500 person company is a lot smoother and easier than getting a head of engineer or head of prod at like a JP Morgan, where like they might be overseeing a team of 600, 700 people. What I would say is even more unique to fintechs is also by the nature of the fintech, the products that we offer are unique, right? It's um, so the laws and regulations that we are testing against aren't written for the products that we offer, right? They're written for products that were offered by banks for years, and one having to interpret that ourselves to say like, all right, this is what I think we have to test against. This is what I think is is what the law, the regulation is saying we have to do for X, what this part of our program, but then having to explain that to a regulator. That's kind of been the uniqueness of my job, but it's also kind of the fun part of my job, right? I get to build something new and build something unique, and then kind of operate in this like teaching role where like I'm teaching a regulator to be like, hey, like here's the product, I know it's unique, and here's why it's a good product.
Yeah, that last part is pretty interesting, right? Because you sort of have to smooth it over, and if you're doing it right, then at least you get to kind of color their perception on what a product might
Exactly.
look like.
Exactly.
Um, that sort of leads me to my next question, actually, which is that, Melio is in an interesting spot in that you guys actually have money transmitter licenses, which is not the most common thing in fintech. So would you say that by having the money transmitter licenses, does it make it feel more like a hybrid model between banking and fintech? Does it still feel much more like a fintech? And also, how does that color your approach with having the licenses to testing, to oversight? I imagine there's a lot more risk exposure given that you have a license that you could theoretically lose.
Yeah, so I would say one of the things that I think Melio prides itself on, one of the things that I was very surprised is when I first started here, is the culture of compliance was kind of always at the forefront of Melio's mission. Um, so you know, we compliance was always very important, and testing and oversight of compliance was always very important, even though it was a very small operation at the time of me joining. Um, and I think by nature, yeah, when now that we have money transmitter licenses, that there kind of is that hybrid model where like we're testing and we're making sure there are certain things that are in line with the laws and the rules that our partners are setting forth for us for our program, but also now to have to do that to ensure that like what we're building is also in line um, with the laws and regulations of our regulators. So it's definitely kind of feels like a hybrid model, right? Like you kind of have to answer to two different entities. But what I will say is that, the way we've tailored or we have to tailor our testing, being a regulated entity now, is like now the stakes are higher. We own the risk, and we have to tailor our testing to ensure that we're testing to the highest level of scrutiny, right? So, it's really sitting down and like looking at the regulations. Like, it was one thing to sit down to look at like the rules that like, JP Morgan would give us, be like, hey, this is what you just have to like make sure you're not submitting payments to these types of businesses, or ensure that you're reporting X, Y, and Z to us. But now to have to sit down and look at the laws and regulations of each local state regulator and be like, okay, like, is our transaction monitoring program or is our KYC in line with what California says is supposed to be versus the DFS, and like having to test the program around that. So, naturally we work in this hybrid model, and naturally our testing has to evolve. But I think what we've done at Melio, and what I think works, is just ensuring that we're testing to the highest level of scrutiny that our regulator or a partner sets forth for us.
Yeah, though, it makes a lot of sense. And I actually want to pick up on something that you mentioned there, especially for people who might be at smaller fintechs. You said that once you got to Melio, they already had sort of a good tone at the top about compliance.
Yes. Yes.
I would say that that's somewhat of a rarity in the
Mm-hmm.
industry.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think drove that, and what would you advise that other fintechs do in order to be able to establish that early? Because whether people like it or not, compliance is going to be a massive part of your business.
It's exactly what you said, George. It's the tone is from the top, right? Like us in leadership and our managers, like the tone, like the culture of compliance can only be as strong as you make it, right? So it's not coming in to a firm and saying like, I am compliance and what I says goes and I'm the guy who says no. It's like, it's letting people know, like, what's worked for me is, sitting down with all of the stakeholders, with our stakeholders and in the business, our stakeholders in product and engineering, and letting them know like, hey, like, we're on the same team here. I want the firm to succeed. And by having a strong culture of compliance and a strong compliance program, that's going to ensure that our firm continues to exceed 10 years from now. Because, as we see in the news, like one slip up or one deficiency in your compliance program, you're either getting fined millions of dollars, or a regulator can say like, you can no longer bank in the US. And nobody wants that, So it's exactly what you said. It's setting the tone from the top. And I think that's what we at Melio did, and Payoneer as well, is, having like the CCO sit with everybody, having directors sit with the teams, and having the CEO saying on an all hands how important compliance is. And working at smaller fintechs, I think that we have the luxury of working with a smaller team, and getting that message across is a lot, by nature, is a lot easier. But yeah, it's just letting people know that we're partners. We're not here to tell you no. We're not here to shut down business. We're here to grow the business, and we're here to ensure that it exists 10 years from now.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Moving to a slightly different topic. So, obviously, whether you're regulated or not, most fintechs and banks have to undergo annual audits, or in the fintech's case with a partner bank, you'll usually have something like a quarterly assessment where they're sort of looking at your program. So given that a lot of companies that are undergoing this, and then you might get some kind of sort of finding from the audits, fintechs usually end up being a little bit reactive in nature to that. Do you think that there's a benefit in having some sort of a real-time feedback loop about your program, so that whether it's daily, weekly, bi-weekly, you're sort of getting feedback about each one of your controls that are already in place?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know who wouldn't benefit from real-time feedback. Like I said earlier, the products that fintechs offer are unique in nature, and we're trying to set up programs based on laws and regulations that are written for products that were written for fintechs. They're written for traditional banking. So if we had like a real-time feedback and feedback loop with regulators and auditors to say like, hey, like here's the program we built, or here's the product we're launching, and here's how we've interpreted the regulations, and here's how we've worked it into our product. Does this work? Does this not work? If it doesn't work, like, can we get some feedback on how we can fix it? I think, we absolutely would benefit from real-time feedback. I think everybody would.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously I'm presuming Melio is big enough where you do have a sort of a second line
Oh
QA
yeah.
team.
Mhm.
As of right now, is the QA team overseeing the program sort of in a manual sense, or is Melio using anything specific to automate and test the program and how well it's running today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's running extremely smooth. Like I've been here, it's coming up on 2 years in August. Um, and like I said, like we've built 3 separate work streams in 2 years, and they're not, we did just build it. They're up and running. And we've had our, um, we've tested it and things are working. And at the moment it's very manual, but I think that's what works for us right now. I think because we're smaller and because we're new, to kind of really be under the hood of things, like having like our second line testing and QA team, like manually under the hood and manually like working and looking at things. I think not only is it working, it's what we need, and I think maybe at some point we'd probably look into to automation, just like down the line.
Sure, makes sense. Um, all right, and this we touched upon a little bit. You sort of alluded to some of the regulatory scrutiny, but over the past couple of years, we've seen consent orders specifically related to partner bank and fintech relationships. So you guys both have money transmission licenses, but you also do have banks that you partner with. Seeing all these things that are coming out, I have to imagine that this is bringing compliance even more to the forefront of your approach. Just knowing that these regulators are so much more invested in how these relationships are after well over a decade of sort of not really paying attention to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think it just makes like I said, compliance was always kind of at the forefront of Media's mission, but now that we're regulated, and when a consent order comes out, or or a fine comes out because there were deficiencies in a partner bank's fintech book, we present this to our senior stakeholders, and we're saying like, hey, like we know that that compliance is important, but we just want you to know like how important it is and how much scrutiny we're under. Um, and it's just to know, it just highlights the importance of, one, having a strong um, culture of compliance, but two, having a strong testing program, right? So we want to make sure that our testing is strong, and that we're testing to the highest level of scrutiny, because we don't want to be the next fintech that's making headline news because of deficiencies of local bonders in their programs.
Yeah, if you're going to be in the news, you want it to be something good, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Or I guess in your case, right, there has been a little bit of news for you guys with the acquisition. So
Yeah, exactly. That's the good news that we want. We don't want the bad press of deficiencies in an AML program or a transaction monitoring program.
no, absolutely. Um, and then you know, you were introduced to it with your current role, but you and I have talked about this before, and you are moving into a different role where you're going to be more regulatory facing.
Yeah.
So this question seems appropriate. There's definitely been some uncertainty, I would say, with the current administration and
Mhm.
how seriously they're going to take certain enforcement of certain financial regulations. What will they be as heavily scrutinized as previous ones? Um, so how do you foresee the various state regulators looking at this if the feds are not pushing as hard? Do you think that more states will just start kind of picking up the slack where the federal regulators are not looking at things as closely?
Yeah. So, you know, the administration changes every 4 years, right? And what they enforce and don't enforce, what they don't regulate and don't regulate, is going to change based on who's in office, right? But in my experience, the state level regulators, like the state regulators, they're always filling that gap, right? Um, And I feel like no matter who's in office, in my experience at least, no matter who's in office, like the state level, like if we don't enforce like if they don't enforce something at the federal level, the state regulators are going to fill that gap and say like, actually, no, we are enforcing this. Um, and that goes back to what I was saying earlier is that when you're setting up a compliance program, um, whether you're a regulated entity or you're operating under an FBO model, you want to set up the program to the highest level of scrutiny. Um, you want to set it up to, in my experience, one of the toughest regulators, um, for good or for bad, is the DFS, right? So you always like, in my experience, right, you want to set up your programs to kind of to be in line with like that DFS level of scrutiny. You want to make sure that you are adhering to everything. You want to have like a sound compliance program, and I think that's the case no matter who's in office and no matter who's like what's being enforced at the federal level, because no matter what, the state regulators are always going to fill that gap.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think I remember hearing one time that the DFS is basically just one of the most powerful regulators, federal or state, in the country, and it makes sense. The center of most banking is in New York,
Absolutely.
so
Absolutely. I mean, New York is the financial one of the financial hubs of the world, and it just makes sense that they're, one of the toughest regulators, and that's why, like, when you're setting up a program, like, it always makes sense to kind of set up a program to the level of DFS scrutiny.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It sort of preempts my next question because I was going to ask, with money transmission licenses being a state-to-state thing, how do you keep on top of different regulatory changes in each state, and do you have some sort of a tracking mechanism for it right now?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's always been kind of a manual thing, and I think it might be nice. I know there are some companies out there that will do the tracking for you, but it's like compliance as a line of business is relatively new in like the finance world. Um, so things are kind of always changing. Um, and you want to make sure that your program is swift and agile and can make changes quickly. Um, so you want to be working closely with auditors, and you want to be working closely with regulators, but also working closely, like doing things like this, like you and I bouncing ideas off of each other. But we meet for coffee, and it's like learning like what works and what doesn't work. And I feel like as fintechs, we kind of have to, I would say, band together, because like not only is the environment of regulatory ever changing, but it's ever changing, for fintechs who offer these unique products, and it's, who are adhering to laws that, like I said, I know I keep saying it, but it's the truth. Like, we're adhering to laws that weren't written for us; they were written for traditional banks. So, um, it's being agile, being quick to change, and really working with others.
Yeah, and to that last point, so agility is somewhat easy, for people in positions like you, or positions I've held when you're at a fintech, but the goal is always growth, right? And then you
Yep.
and I have both seen the bureaucracy that lives once you get more into the realm of traditional banking.
Correct.
How do you sort of approach program design so that it's agile at the fintech level, but can still be or not reactive, but agile at the level where you're looking to grow to?
I think that's where, again, I think that's where having good relationships internally really really benefits you, right? So if we have to, if let's say we have to make a change, there's a regulatory change and we have to make a change to the way our systems are generating alerts. If you have, like, for me, if you have like being agile and swift, and me being able to get a product manager on us, like, send them a Slack and get on a call right away, to say like, hey, like, we need to make this change and we need to do it quick. Um, that's what it comes back to my message of working well with others, and setting the tone from the top about the importance of the culture of compliance, and letting teams know, okay, we're all one team here. So for me, like, a program can only be as agile as strong as the team working on it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's an excellent point. We have a few minutes left, so I'm actually gonna, I don't have any more questions from my end, so I will open it up to anybody in the of the attendees who may have some questions.
Awesome.
Please feel free to ask. Not seeing anything so far. There's one. All right, the question is, what will you change for automation to be a must in oversight?
What would change automation from oversight? Hmm. I don't know. That's a good question. I think there's a fine line between like automation and manual work, and um, it just depends on what works and what doesn't. There's certain things that you can automate and certain things you can't automate, like the decisioning of a SAR. That just you can never automate that. Um, when it comes to, I think when it comes to like maybe tracking remediation efforts and testing, like that's definitely something that you can benefit from automation. It really just depends on what on the area of the program that you're trying to automate.
Sure. So to use an example to, like you said, with SARS, so I totally agree with you. SAR writing, you can never automate that out.
Nope.
But a way to track, let's say, the SLAs to make sure that
Yes.
you're meeting all your SLAs, you would say
Yes.
that that's something that should definitely be automated away and definitely help to strengthen your program, something like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. We do have another question. I think this is an evergreen one when it comes to the fintech space. In the buy versus build debate, how do you decide what makes sense to outsource versus building in-house?
I guess it depends on what resources we have available within the firm. So, for instance, I worked at a firm where we decided to outsource the sanctions compliance, right? Like, so we outsourced that to a third party. And it just made the most sense from a cost effective standpoint, right? Like we could, you could move quicker when when you're building an in-house, when you're outsourcing, right? So you can kind of bring in kind of like, I like to say plug and play, right? So, you can kind of bring like, if you need to move quicker, it kind of makes more sense to outsource certain things. Um, but if you have the time, I think kind of building in-house kind of makes sense because you can tailor it specifically to the products that you offer and the services that you offer. In my experience, there are tons and tons and tons of outsourced and third party tools out there, like say for like case management. But there's never been like no one's ever had like a one size fit all to say like, here's our platform and like just plug and play. There's always some kind of fine tuning you have to work. So I think if you have the time, it kind of makes sense to build in house because you can tailor it to exactly the needs of your company and the exact needs of your programming. So for me, it really just depends on time and cost.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think no matter how many times this question comes up, I think it's always it's usually dependent on the organization
Yeah,
and tone at the top, like you alluded to earlier. So yeah,
exactly.
absolutely.
Exactly.
That basically takes us to time. Danny, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I think this was a very informative conversation, and we really appreciate all of your insight.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks all.
Bye
Take
bye.
care.